Welcome dear students to yet another class on the history of English language and literature, and we shall discuss two minor topics in our class today. The first one, the Great Exhibition of 1851, and an important topic, the Victorian Compromise. The Exhibition of 1851 and the topic Victorian Compromise. So let us move on with our first topic, the Great Exhibition of 1851. The Great Exhibition of 1851 was an exhibition of the works of industry of all nations. So what was exhibition? Exhibition of the works of industry of all nations. The exhibition was opened on May Day, the 1st of May in 1851 by Queen Victoria, and it lasted till October 11th, 1851. It was the first ever international exhibition of this kind. It was a magnificent display of manufactured products from steam engines to a myriad of other products from Britain and its empire and the whole world. So it was done to showcase, to display the industrial and cultural products of the world. So the industrial products of the world were displayed. Now it drew exhibitors and visitors from all over the world. So great exhibition. The Great Exhibition of 1851 displayed the general prosperity in London, and it made the Victorians complacent. So we talk about the complacency of the Victorians. Now what is the meaning of complacent? Complacent means a feeling of satisfaction with oneself or with one's achievements. So the Victorian complacency was shown in the Great Exhibition of 1851. It testified to the world the material progress and the industrial domination of England. So it displayed the industrial domination, the material progress of England. It was an exhibition that proved to the whole world that England was at the top of the world. None could be compared to the material progress and the industrial development and the industrial domination of England. So that is the Great Exhibition of 1851, which proved that the Victorians were complacent. The complacency of the Victorians were displayed in this Great Exhibition of 1851. Now let us move on to our second topic, the Victorian Compromise. So this is an important topic from the point of view of examination. Now compromise is a term that is closely associated with the Victorian period. The Victorian England was generally peaceful. There were many changes taking place in the society. There was industrialization and rapid growth of science and technology. There was a cry for freedom, democracy. There were many reform acts that were implemented by the British Parliament. We have discussed all of them. Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution, how this theory of evolution had brought so much of doubt, so much of skepticism into the minds of people. We have talked about Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution. Now the traditional Bible-centered faith was shattered. The traditional Bible-centered faith was shattered with the theory of evolution. And Sigmund Freud, whom we have discussed, with his theory of the mind, gave new insight into the human mind. J.S. Mill, John Stuart Mill and the others championed the cause of the poor working class. We also talked about Karl Marx and his theory of Marxism, which challenged the hierarchical order of the social system and challenged those of the upper strata of the society. There were cries for equality and for equal representation in the parliament and the universal enfranchisement. There was a cry for democracy. Now these and many other revolutionary ideals were going on, and these were the characteristics of the Victorian era. But my dear students, even though so many changes, so many revolutionary ideas were going on, the general situation of the Victorian era remained peaceful, and there were no blood revolutions because of the Victorian Compromise. So Victorian Compromise would say that even though there were so many changes that were taking place in the socio-political scenario, the Victorian England remained peaceful because of this particular concept which we are learning, the Victorian Compromise. Now we know the meaning of the term compromise. What is the meaning of the term compromise? It means to make a deal, with the different parties with opposing demands. So make a deal, to come to a compromise. One party is demanding for one thing, the other party is demanding for the opposite. So what is the meaning of compromise? Compromise means to find an agreement through mutual understanding, to find an agreement through mutual acceptance. So that is the meaning of the word compromise. Now what is Victorian Compromise? There are a few factors which we must consider when we talk about the Victorian Compromise. It is a compromise between science and religion. It is a compromise between royalism and democracy. It is a compromise between the rich and the poor. And it is also the compromise between Romanticism and Realism. So there is a compromise would mean many factors, and we shall discuss one by one. The first factor is Victorian Compromise would mean compromise between the rich and the poor. Compromise between the rich and the poor. Now we have discussed the situation. The industrialization created the rich middle class as well as the poor working class. The conditions of the working class, the conditions of the poor working was very pathetic. They lived in unsafe areas. They had very poor and very often injurious working conditions. They were very often getting sick. The number of hours of work were more than 10 or 12 hours per day. So there is the gap between the rich industrialists and the poor working class. While the industrialists, the rich middle class grew richer and richer, and the comforts of their life doubled, the condition of the poor working class worsened, deteriorated day by day. Thus there was a wide gap between the rich and the poor, between the haves and the have-nots. But a compromise was brought about between the rich and the poor through the different reform acts which we have studied, the factory acts, etc. of the Victorian era. The political economists like J.S. Mill, John Stuart Mill, would champion the cause of the education of everyone and the promotion of trade unions. So the different trade unions that were organized during this time also helped to bring about a compromise between the rich and the poor. So the first compromise is the compromise between the rich and poor. There is a coexistence between the rich and the poor. The second thing that we should remember when we talk about Victorian Compromise is the compromise between science and religion. The rapid growth of science, especially the theory of evolution proposed by Charles Darwin in his epoch-making book, The Origin of Species, it shattered the religious belief of the people to a certain extent. The theory of the evolution by natural selection, that was contrary to the Bible-based theory of creation. It was contrary to the faith of the people who believed in the Bible, the faith of the people who believed in the religion. So there is a contradiction between science and religion. The religion had taught people that God was a creator and God was a preservator of the world. He is the provident Father. Now the origin of species removed the role of God and the presence of God in the creation of man. The evolution of man, the creation of man or evolution of man, it is not a work of God. It is by natural selection. Though some accepted the theory of Darwin, the claims of the religion was not ignored. So there is on one side the religious belief, on the other side there was the discovery of science. People continue to believe in the religion as well. Thus there was a compromise between the religious faith and the newly accepted theories of science. So that is the second point to be remembered, is a compromise between science and religion. The first point was compromise between rich and poor. The second one was compromise between science and religion. Now the third compromise that we should consider when we talk about Victorian Compromise is compromise between Romanticism and Realism. Now the Romantics of the early 19th century protested against the rules and dogmas of the past, the Romanticists. They focused on imagination, they tried to escape from the realities of the world, and they turned to the nature. There is a glorification of nature. But the Victorians, a few of them were still influenced by Romanticism. So it is not totally against Romanticism. The Victorians were, a few of them were still influenced by Romanticism. The others were realists. Now the realists revolted against Romanticism, and the realists tried to portray the contemporary people and the contemporary situations with the truth and accuracy. So Romanticism would rely on imagination, and realism, they are trying to portray the contemporary people and solutions with accuracy. The Industrial Revolution, the rise of democracy, the impact of science, the miseries of the poor, all these themes were realistically portrayed by these realists. So they were the realities of the times, and these realities brought down the writers, we can say, from the ivory tower of imagination to the realities of the contemporary situations. So the Romanticists relied on imagination. Here the Victorians, they relied on the actual facts of life. Thus we see a compromise between Romanticism and Realism. That was the third factor of Victorian compromise. The fourth and the last compromise that we are discussing is the compromise between Royalism and democracy. Compromise between Royalism and democracy. Now during the Victorian era, England was still ruled by a monarch, Queen Victoria. She was ruling. The prominence given to Royalism was still upheld, but at the same time there was a demand for democracy. We have talked about the Chartist movement. The Chartist movement and the People's Charter were continuously demanding for democracy. Democracy would strip the king of their power, of his power, would strip the queen of her power. Thus in political life there was a compromise between democracy and Royalism. The rights of the aristocracy was defended. The rights of the monarch was defended. At the same time, the rising demand of the masses for political equality and democracy was accepted. So there was a compromise between democracy and Royalism. Now there was no, when we study the Victorian era, there was no violent revolutionary upheavals and bloodshed during the Victorian era. While in other parts of the world violent revolutions were taking place, England remained peaceful. There was general peace and tranquility in the social and political life in England. The progressive ideals were reconciled with conservative learning. So both sides were there. There was stability even amidst disturbing circumstances. In short, we can say that the Victorian society witnessed compromise between science and religion, compromise between rich and the poor, compromise between Royalism and democracy, and compromise between Romanticism and Realism. Now this compromise, that is what led to the peace and tranquility during the Victorian era. My dear students, we have come to the end of this short lecture, and in this lecture we have discussed two minor points. The first point was the Great Exhibition of 1851. The Great Exhibition of 1851 showed the complacency of the Victorian times, the Victorian England. The second topic that we have discussed is the Victorian Compromise. And under Victorian Compromise, we talked about the compromise between the rich and the poor, the compromise between the science and religion, the compromise between Romanticism and Realism, and finally the compromise between Royalism and democracy. For the assignment, please write a short summary about the Great Exhibition of 1851 as well as the Victorian Compromise. Please, for the information, this particular topic, the Victorian Compromise, was very often asked as university questions. So please make a detailed study of the Victorian Compromise. Thank you for your patient listening. Have a nice time.